It started like any other Saturday morning. The sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, casting warm, golden patterns on the freshly mopped floor. I sipped my coffee, watching my two kids play with their toys in the living room. The house was quiet, peaceful, the kind of morning that made you grateful for the little things in life. But that peace was about to shatter. I noticed something outside, a bright yellow paper fluttering on my front door, dancing in the gentle breeze. Curious, I walked outside, barefoot, the smooth concrete of the driveway cool beneath my feet. The paper was an official-looking notice, crisp and neat, with bold letters that seemed to scream for attention. My first thought was that it might be a parking warning or a community newsletter. But as I unfolded the document, my heart began to race. Violation notice. It read in large, intimidating letters. Beneath that was a list of supposed infractions that made absolutely no sense. Grass length. Mailbox placement. Fence height. I looked around my meticulously maintained lawn. The grass was trimmed, the flower beds were neat, and my mailbox stood exactly where it had been for years. Nothing was out of place. So why was I being fined? My mind raced back to when we bought this house 2 years ago. It was a beautiful single-story home in what seemed like a quiet, friendly neighborhood. The previous owner had never mentioned anything about a homeowners association HOA. In fact, when we purchased the property, there was no HOA documentation in any of our closing papers. I called my real estate agent, Emily, who had helped us buy the house. Her voice sounded uncertain when I described the notice. "That's strange," she said. "I don't recall any HOA being active in your neighborhood when we closed the deal." As I hung up the phone, movement caught my attention. A sleek black SUV slowly rolled down the street, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. It crawled past my house, almost as if it was watching, waiting. The driver seemed to be taking mental notes, eyes scanning every inch of my property. My youngest daughter, Lily, ran up to me, her teddy bear tucked under her arm. "Daddy, what's wrong?" she asked, her big eyes looking up at me with concern. I forced a smile, not wanting to worry her. "Nothing, sweetie. Just some boring grown-up stuff." But it wasn't nothing. Something felt off. The research begins. I spent the next few hours buried in research. Property records, neighborhood maps, local government websites. I dove deep, my computer screen filled with documents, highlighted passages, and cross-referenced information. If someone was going to challenge me, I'd be prepared. By late afternoon, I discovered something interesting. While there were mentions of a neighborhood association, there was no official record of it being a legally binding homeowners association with the power to issue fines or enforce regulations. Something wasn't adding up. Just as I was about to call it a day, another envelope arrived. This one was hand-delivered. No postmark, no return address. Inside was another violation notice, this time with a detailed invoice for what they claimed were ongoing maintenance violations. The total, $350. My wife, Claire, walked in, seeing the papers spread across the table. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and concern. Before I could answer, my phone rang. An unknown number. "Mr. Carter," a sharp, stern voice said. "This is Margaret from the Willow Creek Community Board." Little did I know, this was the first move in a game that would consume our entire lives. The surveillance. The SUV passed by again, slower this time. Its tinted window rolled down just enough to reveal a pair of cold, calculating eyes watching our house. Something told me this was just the beginning. The yellow envelope arrived like a snake slithering under my door. Another citation. This time, it claimed my fence was 3 inches too tall and the wrong shade of white. I'd painted it last summer, carefully matching the color chip from the local hardware store. My hands trembled slightly as I read the fine print. $500 for noncompliance. I walked outside, measuring tape in hand. The fence was exactly 6 feet tall, standard residential height. The white was a perfect match to the neighborhood's supposed approved color palette. Something didn't add up. My neighbor, Greg, watched from his yard. We'd been friendly before, but lately, he avoided eye contact. When I waved, he quickly turned away, rushing inside his house. The neighborhood felt different, tense, like everyone was holding their breath. The pattern emerges. I started documenting everything. Photos of the fence, measurements, precise notes about each citation. My laptop became my weapon, filled with spreadsheets tracking every bizarre accusation from Margaret and her HOA board. A quick internet search revealed something interesting. Margaret wasn't just an HOA board member. She was a real estate broker with a history of aggressive property management. Her LinkedIn profile showed connections to several local development companies. My gut told me this was about more than just fence heights. That evening, I discovered an old property map in my filing cabinet. It was from the previous owner, and something caught my eye. No HOA registration, no covenant documents. How could they find me for a membership I never joined? Claire looked worried. Maybe we should just pay the fine and be done with it, she whispered, glancing nervously out the window. But I knew giving in would only make things worse. The isolation. The next morning, more orange cones appeared around our property. Delivery trucks started avoiding our street. The local pizza place, which had delivered here for years, suddenly couldn't find our address. Something was very wrong. I called the county recorder's office. The clerk seemed uncomfortable when I asked about our property's HOA status. "I can't discuss that over the phone," she said quickly. "You'll need to come in person." That's when the first surveillance van appeared. Dark windows, no markings, just sitting at the end of our street, watching. Claire packed an emergency bag that night. "Just in case," she said, her voice shaking. Our kids were scared. They'd overheard arguments, seen the tension. School had become difficult. Other parents whispered. Kids stopped playing with our children. I discovered something else. 3 houses on our street had been sold in the past year, all to properties connected to Margaret's real estate company. A pattern was emerging, but I needed proof. The breaking point. At the county offices, I requested every document related to our property. The clerk seemed nervous, shuffling papers, avoiding eye contact. When I mentioned Margaret's name, she went pale. "Some things are better left alone," she muttered, sliding a partial file across the desk. My phone buzzed. An unknown number. The voice was distorted, mechanical. "Stop digging," it said. Then silence. Claire found me sorting through documents that night. Stacks of papers covered our dining room table. Maps, property records, citation notices. A web of connections was forming, but the full picture remained just out of reach. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I looked up, a plan forming. "I'm going to expose everything." The fight back. The street outside was quiet, too quiet. A single light flickered at the end of the block. Something was watching, waiting. I knew one thing for certain, this was far from over. The orange cones appeared overnight, like mushrooms after rain. I first noticed them when I went to grab my morning newspaper, which wasn't even in its usual spot. 5 bright orange markers created a makeshift barricade around my property line, each one sporting a crisp white printed notice that read, "Community Standards Violation" in bold letters. Greg, who'd always been friendly, suddenly avoided eye contact. When I waved, he quickly turned and walked inside his house. Something was changing, and I could feel it in the air, a thick tension that seemed to wrap around the entire street like invisible spiderwebs. I decided to document everything. My smartphone became my most important tool. Each cone, each sign, each strange occurrence got carefully photographed and timestamped. I knew documentation would be crucial if this situation escalated further. By midday, things got even weirder. A large white van with no markings pulled up across the street. 2 men in generic dark uniforms began installing additional surveillance cameras. They weren't city workers. Their movements were too calculated, too precise. When I approached to ask questions, they simply pointed to Margaret, who was watching from her perfectly manicured front yard. "Just following board instructions," one of the men mumbled when I asked about the cameras. Margaret's smile was like ice, sharp and cold. She held a thick folder of papers, her manicured fingers gripping them so tightly her knuckles turned white. I could see various documents peeking out, some with official-looking letterheads. The revelation. My research began in earnest. I pulled out property records, searching for any connection between my home and the HOA. The previous owner had never mentioned any association fees or regulations. Something wasn't adding up. I discovered the neighborhood had a complicated history. 20 years ago, there was an attempted development that failed. Some paperwork suggested a partial HOA formation that was never fully completed. The legal boundaries were murky at best. Delivery trucks started avoiding my street. The FedEx driver, who'd known me for years, now would wave from a distance, refusing to approach. My mailbox, which had always been a standard black metal box, mysteriously disappeared overnight. When I called the post office, They seemed confused, saying no report of removal had been filed. Margaret's tactics were becoming more aggressive. I watched her talking to other neighbors, her animated gestures and hushed tones suggesting she was spreading some kind of story about me. People who'd wave hello just weeks ago now crossed the street to avoid me. My family was feeling the pressure. Claire started asking if we should consider moving. My kids were becoming anxious, noticing the strange looks from their friends and the tension in our home. I knew I had to stay calm, to show them that we wouldn't be bullied. The final stand. I started a digital documentation project, a private blog, carefully worded to avoid any potential legal issues, chronicling the strange events. Each post was factual, calm, supported by photographs and time-stamped evidence. I wasn't looking to attack, just to reveal the truth. The barricades expanded. More cones appeared. Yellow caution tape somehow found its way around parts of my property. It looked like a crime scene, except the only crime was the harassment happening in broad daylight. When I tried calling the local authorities, they seemed hesitant. It's a civil matter, they'd say. A dispute between you and the HOA. But this was more than a dispute. This was systematic isolation. I noticed Margaret would drive by multiple times a day, always slow, always watching. Her SUV, with its tinted windows, became a symbol of the growing tension. Each pass felt like a calculated move in some bizarre psychological chess game. My research continued. I discovered Margaret had been involved in several similar situations in other neighborhoods. Property records, online forums, and careful cross-referencing revealed a pattern of aggressive neighborhood control tactics. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the barricaded street, I knew one thing: this was far from over. The orange cones might block my driveway, the cameras might watch my every move, but they couldn't block my determination. Something big was coming, and I was ready. Who would break first, me or Margaret? The turning point. The local library became my second home. Stacks of property records, real estate documents, and local history surrounded me like a fortress of paper and hope. My fingers traced lines of tiny print, searching for any clue that might explain why Margaret was so determined to push me out of my home. I started with the basics, property maps spread across the library's large wooden table. Each one was a puzzle piece I was desperate to solve. The librarian, an older woman with kind eyes, brought me extra copies of county records, whispering encouragement. Sometimes the truth is hidden in the smallest details, she said, sliding an old property ledger toward me. Days blended together. My research consumed me. I discovered something strange about the Willow Creek development. The original land purchase showed multiple ownership transfers, each more complicated than the last. Margaret's name appeared repeatedly, not just as an HOA board member, but as a real estate broker connected to several shell companies. Late one night, comparing property records from the past decade, I found a pattern. Margaret had been involved in at least 3 similar situations in different neighborhoods. Families pushed out, properties quickly resold, massive developments rising where quiet homes once stood. This wasn't just about me. This was her business model. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of the documents. Each photo felt like a weapon against her carefully constructed lies. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the electricity of discovery. Something big was happening, and I was finally understanding the game. A text from Claire interrupted my concentration. "Are you okay? You've been gone for hours." I realized I hadn't told her about my research. How could I explain the web of corruption I was unraveling? Some discoveries needed time, needed careful consideration. The property map revealed an interesting detail. Our neighborhood sat on a prime location, close to a new highway expansion, near developing commercial zones. The land value was about to skyrocket. Suddenly, everything made sense. Margaret wasn't just an HOA board member. She was a predator, targeting families like mine to clear the way for massive real estate development. I found a series of emails, accidentally left in a public records file, showing communication between Margaret and several local developers. They discussed property clearance and community restructuring in cold, calculated language. These weren't people, they were numbers on a spreadsheet. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unknown number. The message was brief: "Stop digging. Some secrets are better left alone." A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just about a lawn or a mailbox anymore. This was about power, money, and who gets to decide what happens to people's homes. I remembered my grandmother's advice. Knowledge is the only true weapon against those who think they're untouchable. She had fought similar battles in her time, standing up to powerful people who thought they could push around ordinary families. The library was closing as I gathered my documents. The kind librarian approached. "Be careful," she whispered, her eyes darting around the empty room. "Some people don't like it when you start asking too many questions." I knew then that my fight was just beginning. Margaret thought she could intimidate me, push me out, erase my family's presence in this neighborhood. But she had no idea what I was capable of. As I walked out, the evening sun casting long shadows, I realized something important. This wasn't just about my home anymore. This was about justice. This was about showing that ordinary people could stand up to those who thought they were above the rules. My phone buzzed one more time. A message from an unknown sender. Just 6 words that would change everything. I know what they're trying to do. The final confrontation. The morning sun cast long shadows across my kitchen as I spread out the growing collection of documents. Stacks of papers covered every inch of the table. Property records, HOA communication logs, and meticulously copied citations. My youngest daughter, Lily, watched me from the doorway, her eyes filled with a mixture of worry and hope. "Dad," she said softly, "are we going to be okay?" I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "We're going to figure this out," I promised, though the uncertainty gnawed at my insides. Each document told a piece of a larger puzzle. I'd started tracking every interaction with Margaret and her HOA board, creating a timeline that seemed almost impossible to believe. Handwritten notes documented strange occurrences, delivery trucks turning around, neighbors avoiding eye contact, mysterious vehicles parked just out of sight. My computer screen flickered with county property maps. Something wasn't adding up. I cross-referenced the neighborhood plat with historical land records, noticing subtle discrepancies that most people would overlook. The HOA's boundaries seemed to shift subtly in recent years, with property lines redrawn in ways that didn't make sense. A knock at the door made me jump. I approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. It was Mrs. Thompson from 2 doors down, an elderly neighbor who had always been kind but recently seemed scared. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered when I opened the door, glancing nervously over her shoulder. She pressed an old manila envelope into my hands. "You didn't get this from me." Before I could ask anything, she was already walking away, her steps quick and anxious. Inside the envelope, I found something that made my heart race. Old property contracts, annotated with handwritten notes, dates, names, connections that began to explain the elaborate game Margaret was playing. My phone rang. An unknown number. "You're asking too many questions," a distorted voice warned. The call disconnected before I could respond. Claire entered the room, sensing the tension. "What's wrong?" I hesitated, weighing how much to share. The last thing I wanted was to worry her more than she already was. Our entire family was under incredible stress. The HOA's tactics had turned our life into a nightmare. Mail stopped, delivery services refusing to approach our home, neighbors treating us like we were somehow contagious. I'd been documenting everything, every citation, every strange interaction, every attempt to isolate us. My laptop was filled with screenshots, recordings, and careful notes. I was building a case, but I knew I had to be smart about it. The local news might be interested, but I needed more than just my word. I needed irrefutable proof that would show the pattern of harassment. My research was revealing something bigger than a simple dispute. This looked like a systematic effort to push out homeowners. Lily's school project sat half-finished on the dining room table, a poster about community and fairness. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here we were, fighting for the most basic rights while being treated like outsiders in our own neighborhood. Another envelope arrived. This one was different, official-looking, with a return address for a law firm I didn't recognize. My hand shook slightly as I opened it. Inside, a single typed page, a threat, more documentation. The first line would change everything. Just then, my computer pinged with an email. The sender was unknown, but the subject line sent a chill down my spine. "What they don't want you to know." I realized we were no longer just fighting an HOA. We were fighting a system designed to break people down, to make them give up. And I wasn't about to let that happen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. One click could set everything in motion. One piece of evidence could be the key to breaking this entire situation wide open. But at what cost? The phone rang again. This time, the caller ID was blocked. The community center showdown. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as I walked in, my folder of carefully collected documents tucked under my arm. Margaret sat at the front of the room, her perfectly pressed blazer and sharp-edged smile in stark contrast to my wrinkled shirt and determined expression. The HOA board members surrounded her like loyal soldiers, their eyes cold and calculating. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. Every late-night research session, every property map I'd studied, every legal document I'd pored over. It all came down to these next few minutes. My hands were steady, despite the storm brewing inside me. We're here to discuss the ongoing issues with 1742 Willow Creek Lane, Margaret began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. The homeowner has accumulated significant fines and continues to resist our community standards. I cleared my throat. I'm not a registered HOA member. The property was sold to me without any HOA documentation. A murmur rippled through the room. Margaret's smile flickered for just a moment, so quick that most would have missed it. But I caught it. This was my first small victory. My evidence was meticulously organized, property records showing no HOA agreement, surveillance photos of their illegal barricades, copies of communications that showed clear harassment. Each document was a weapon, carefully selected and positioned to dismantle their claims. "Miss Thompson," I said calmly, "I have documentation proving that the HOA boundaries were never legally established for my specific property. These barricades are not just inappropriate, they're potentially illegal." The room went silent. I could see the panic behind Margaret's carefully maintained facade. She'd built her reputation on intimidation, on making homeowners feel powerless. But I wasn't playing her game anymore. My daughter, Lily, had helped me compile a social media presentation, screenshots, timelines, documented evidence. We'd created a narrative that was impossible to ignore. Local news had already shown interest. A journalist was sitting in the back of the room, notebook open. "These fines are fabricated," I continued, spreading out bank statements and HOA communications. "Look at the inconsistent billing, the random charges, the lack of clear documentation." Margaret's colleague, a balding man with thick glasses, started shifting uncomfortably. I could see doubt creeping into their ranks. But Margaret wasn't finished. She pulled out her own folder, her hands slightly trembling. "We have our own documentation," she declared. "The homeowner has repeatedly violated community standards." I knew this was coming. My research had prepared me for her tactics. "May I see those documents?" I asked, my voice calm and measured. As she handed them over, I noticed something, a pattern. Tiny inconsistencies that most would overlook. Dates that didn't quite match. Signatures that seemed slightly off. The journalist leaned forward, her pen poised. "Miss Thompson," I said softly, "I think we both know these documents won't stand up to scrutiny." A bead of sweat formed on Margaret's forehead. She wasn't used to being challenged. Her entire system relied on people feeling overwhelmed, scared, unable to fight back. But I wasn't that person, not anymore. The room felt electric. Everyone knew something significant was happening. This wasn't just about a single homeowner anymore. This was about power, about community, about standing up against systematic bullying. My phone buzzed. A message from a local civil rights attorney who had been following my case. "Keep going. We're preparing something." Margaret's perfect composure was cracking for the first time. She looked genuinely uncertain. I had one more card to play, something that would change everything. The final blow. The city library became my war room. Spread across 3 tables were property maps, HOA documents, and years of neighborhood records. My fingers traced the intricate lines of land ownership, connecting dots most people would miss. Each document was a puzzle piece, and I was determined to complete the picture. I knew Margaret's game wasn't just about me. This was a pattern, a calculated method of pushing out homeowners who didn't fit her perfect neighborhood vision. My laptop screen flickered with saved screenshots, emails, and unofficial records. One thing became clear. I wasn't her first target, and I wouldn't be her last. My teenage daughter, Lily, surprised me that afternoon. She walked in with a stack of printed papers, screenshots from neighborhood social media groups. "Dad," she said, her voice steady, "people are talking. More families have similar stories." Her research was meticulous, showing a trail of similar HOA harassment cases stretching back 5 years. The local news seemed hesitant at first, but persistence pays off. I compiled a detailed dossier, dates, times, documentation of every single interaction. Each piece of evidence was carefully labeled, cross-referenced, verified. This wasn't just a complaint. This was a systematic exposure of a deeply broken system. My breakthrough came from an unexpected source. An elderly neighbor, Mr. Rodriguez, no relation to Margaret, approached me during my morning walk. His hands trembled as he handed me an old file. My son was a real estate lawyer, he whispered. He suspected something was wrong with these HOA practices, but never could prove it. The file contained years of hidden correspondence, property transfers, suspicious financial transactions, and connections between HOA board members and local development companies. Each page was a bombshell waiting to explode. The movement grows. Social media became my megaphone. I started a community group, carefully documenting everything. No wild accusations, just pure, verifiable facts. Screenshots of citations, property records, financial discrepancies. Lily helped me create infographics that made the complex information easy to understand. Local journalists started showing interest. One reporter, Sarah Martinez, sat in my kitchen, her notebook filled with questions. "How long has this been happening?" she asked. I showed her the growing file of evidence. Each document told a story of systematic harassment. The turning point came during a city council meeting. I wasn't angry or emotional, just calm, factual, presenting evidence that spoke louder than any passionate speech. Margaret sat in the back, her face a mask of forced composure. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hand. Media coverage exploded. Local news, then regional networks, picked up the story. Property owners from 3 different counties began sharing similar experiences. What started as my personal battle became a community movement. Legal support emerged from unexpected places. A pro bono legal team specializing in property rights contacted me. They saw the potential for a class action lawsuit that could change how HOAs operate. Margaret's network started to crumble. Development plans were suddenly under intense scrutiny. City council members who had been silent now demanded investigations. The very system she had manipulated was now turning against her. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. About protecting families from predatory practices. About creating a fair system where homeowners have real rights. The final hearing. The final hearing was packed, community members, journalists, city officials. Everyone wanted to hear the truth. I stood calm, my file of evidence solid and unshakable. Margaret's carefully constructed world was about to come apart at the seams. As I looked around the room, I realized this was bigger than me. This was about standing up against a system that preys on the vulnerable. About showing that one person, armed with truth and determination, can make a difference. Epilogue. In the end, the HOA was dissolved, and Margaret's real estate schemes were exposed. The neighborhood returned to its quiet, peaceful state, but the scars remained. My family and I stayed, determined to rebuild the sense of community that had been stolen from us. The fight had changed me. It had shown me the power of persistence, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the strength that comes from unity. And as I watched my kids play in the yard, free from the shadow of the HOA, I knew it had all been worth it. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.